Before we dive straight in, let's talk about the tools you need to take this course. In this course, I'm going to use VS Code or Visual Studio Code, along with a few extensions for starting a local web server, formatting our code, and accessing coding shortcuts. You're welcome to use whatever code editor you want if you know what you're doing, but otherwise head over to code.visualstudio.com and download the latest version of VS Code. Now here inside of VS Code, we're going to install a couple of extensions. So let's open the extension panel and let's search for Prettier. Here's the extension that we want to install, Prettier Code Formatter. With this extension, we can format our code and make it look cleaner. And this is a very popular extension. As you can see, it's been downloaded more than 46 million times. So over here, you're going to have an install button. Just click it and you'll be done. Next, we're going to install another extension called Live Server. With this extension, we can launch our website on a local development server to test things out. Again, this is a very popular extension. It's been downloaded more than 50 million times. Now, the final extension we're going to install is going to be Mithril Emmet. This extension is going to give us access to shortcuts when writing HTML code, which you will see throughout the course. Now, in addition to this, we're also going to use a web browser to test our web pages. Again, you can use whatever browser you want, but in this course, I'm going to use Google Chrome, and I encourage you to use the same browser so you can easily follow the course. Now that you have all the tools you need, let's jump straight into the crash course. Hey, what's up? Welcome to the HTML crash course here at ASAP Frontend. Now, before we even dive into this crash course, I just want to say a huge congratulations to you for even being here watching this video. I know from first-hand experience how difficult it can be to take your first steps in this journey. Seeing a ton of videos that are super long can make you feel really intimidated, but you can rest easy because ASAP Frontend is going to take care of you. Follow everything that we tell you to do step by step and you will land a job in tech. Don't get demotivated. But enough with all that, let's jump straight into this crash course so we can get you coding as soon as possible. And we're gonna start this crash course by talking a little bit about what HTML actually is. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's something that you don't really have to remember. We're going to be calling it HTML 100% of the time anyways. But one thing you do need to understand is that HTML is not a programming language. Instead, it's a markup language that we use to build web pages. Now, if you're feeling a little bit confused right now, don't worry. Let's dive into an example so I can show you the difference between a programming language and a markup language. So, right now we are on the ASAP Frontend website. And the actual difference between a programming language and a markup language is that a programming language allows you to set some sort of logic or rules. And one example of this on the ASAP Frontend website is you can see that we are currently logged in. And here we are using a programming language called JavaScript to say, hey, look, the user is logged in. So let's go ahead and show them this video. But the moment we log out of our account, JavaScript says, oh, the user is not logged in anymore. So let's go ahead and show them this pop-up instead. So again, you can see that programming languages set the rules and logic that control how our app works. If the user is logged in, show the video. If they are not, show this instead. But all of the stuff that we see on the page, so that's this image, this button, all of this text, it's all actually set using HTML. So if we go ahead and right click and hit on inspect, all of this writing here is HTML that is determining how our page is going to look. So HTML is basically how we choose what content is going to be on our web page. And I want to quickly add on what actually makes this content look good. So that's the shapes, the colors, the text size, the font size, all of that stuff. That is set by something called CSS. So CSS is how we style our HTML and make it look a lot better. So just a quick recap of everything you just learned. HTML is how we actually set the content of our web page. CSS is how we style that content and make it look good. And then JavaScript is how we actually set the rules and logic that control how our app works. And you are going to be learning these three technologies throughout the program, as well as React and Firebase and a ton of other technologies. And that is going to allow you to build really powerful apps, just like ASAP Frontend. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves right now. Let's first jump into writing our first lines of HTML code. So let's start by heading to our desktop and creating a new folder called HTML Crash Course. And once that is created, we can open up Visual Studio Code and we can drag and drop this folder straight in. So now we have this folder opened up in our Visual Studio Code. What we can do is full screen into that. And what we are going to do in here is create a new file called index.html. So that way VS Code knows that this is a HTML file and that we are going to be writing HTML code. Now, the first thing we always do inside of these files is use the Mithril Emmet boilerplate. So we're going to type in exclamation mark and hit enter. And this is going to give us a really nice HTML boilerplate that we can work on top of. Now, what we are going to do next is right click on our HTML file and hit open with live server. And this is going to open a local development server where we can see and test our HTML code. So what we can do is put this on one side of our screen. So window and then left arrow, and then window and right arrow on our Visual Studio Code. And now we have these two side by side. And if we type something in here, say text, you can see that any changes that we make to this HTML file, we can immediately see inside of our live server. All right, now that we have all of the setup stuff out of the way, let's take a moment to break down all of this code that we have right here, because you're probably seeing a lot of intimidating code and you have no clue what it means. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down step by step right now. And in order to do that, I have to first teach you a little bit about what we call HTML tags. So everything in HTML is made up of tags, and different kinds of tags allow us to choose different kinds of content that we want to show on our page. So for example, at the bottom of this page here, you can see that we have a few different examples of HTML tags. We have button tags, we have paragraph tags, we have H1 tags, which are titles, and you can see that all of these tag names are surrounded in angle brackets. So for example, you can see here with our button tag that we have angle brackets on both sides. And for our paragraph tag, it's the same thing. We have angle brackets on both sides. And finally, for our H1 tag, you can see angle brackets on both sides. So that's definitely something you want to remember. All of our tag names are going to have angle brackets on both sides. Now, another thing you want to make a note of is these tags usually come in pairs. So we usually have a start and an end tag. So for example, let's take a look at our button here. It has a start tag and an end tag. And then we put any content that we want to be inside of this button between these two tags. And the same goes with our paragraph tag. We have a start tag and an end tag, and then we put all of the content that we want in between. And what you'll notice is the end tag looks exactly like the start tag, but just with a forward slash. So if we look at our button end tag, it looks the same as our button start tag, but just with a forward slash. And the same goes with our ending paragraph tag here and our ending H1 tag here. And one last thing you should know is some tags actually close themselves. So some tags don't actually need to have an end tag. But don't worry about that too much. That's something we're going to cover later on in this video. But for now, just focus on making notes on these key important points. And now, enough with the boring theory. Let's dive straight back into our HTML so we can take a look at the different kinds of HTML tags. tags. Alright, so now we're back in our HTML file and everything should be starting to make a little more sense to you now. We have some start tags here, some end tags here, but now let's take a moment to talk about what all of these different tags actually mean. So the first thing you need to know is that every single HTML document is going to have a very specific structure that looks something like this. So we're going to have the doc type HTML at the top, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just saying that, look, this file is a HTML document. And then next we have the HTML tag, which is going to be wrapping all of the HTML that we write. And if we use the Prettier extension that we installed by hitting Alt Shift and F, we can see that a little more clearly. Now the content inside of this HTML element is split up into two halves. We first have a head area and then we have a body area. Now what is inside of this head area actually has nothing to do with the content that we see on our page. So what we actually see. Instead, in here, we normally have some extra information about our website so that search engines like Google or Bing can get a better idea of what our website is actually about. And we also use this head area to link this HTML document to any CSS or JavaScript files that we might want to use. But now let's take a closer look at what is actually inside of our head area right now. So let's hit Control and plus to zoom in on this code. And the first thing we are seeing inside of our head area is this title element. And just to be clear, the difference between a HTML tag and a HTML element is that the tag refers to these individual things right here. So a start tag and an end tag. Now a HTML element refers to the start tag, the end tag, and any content in between. So these three combined make up one HTML element. So again, tags refer to these individual things right here, and an element is created when you have a start tag, an end tag, and you slap any content in between them. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about what this title element actually does. And all it does is set the title of our web page. So you can see we have document written inside of this title, and the web page title in our browser is document. And now if we go in and change this to HTML crash course, you'll see that the title on our webpage changes to HTML crash course. Now next we have these meta tags, and you're probably thinking, what the hell does all of this writing mean? But trust me, in order to become a successful front-end developer and land a job, you do not need to understand what these mean. So with that being said, that's pretty much everything you need to know about our head area. Now it's inside of this body that we are going to be doing all of the dirty work of writing the HTML that appears on our page. So let's remove this text that we have here, and let's actually start writing some HTML inside of our body. So let's create a H1. So type in H1, hit enter, and in between these two tags, we are going to type in hello world. And now you can see we actually see hello world on our page. So now let's add some more HTML. Let's head down here. Let's type in P. So we create a paragraph element, and in between the two tags, let's write I love ASAP front end. And now you can see in smaller text, we are getting I love ASAP front end. So you can see that all of the HTML that we write inside of our body is what is going to appear on our page. And a quick tip I want to show you is if you head to your browser and you hit F12, Chrome and most other browsers are going to give you some developer tools that are going to make your life so much easier when you're writing code and you run into some issues. And inside of these developer tools, there is a ton of tabs that you're going to be using once you get a little more advanced. But for now, we are going to stick to this elements tab right here. So we have our H1 and our paragraph. And what's also super cool is we can directly edit this code inside of our developer tools. So for example, we can click on this H1 and change it from hello world to hi world, and you can see here on our page it's actually being changed without actually changing our original HTML file. But if we hit refresh, it's actually going to go back to normal. So it's going to go back to using our HTML file. So this is going to be really good when you want to test something out, change some things in your code without actually directly changing your HTML file. Because if anything goes wrong or you mess something up, you can just reset the page and it'll go back to normal. So now let's close our developer tools. And let's get rid of the elements that we have inside of our body currently. And now let's dive straight into the different elements that we can use inside of HTML. Now, before we get started, I have a quick tip for you, and that is to hit Control and slash, and that is going to allow you to write comments inside of your code. Now, this doesn't affect the content that we see on our page at all. It's just something that we write in here to make our code a little more readable and help us understand what's actually going on inside of our code. So for example, in here, we are going to type in headings because those are the first HTML tags that we are going to cover. And there's actually 6 heading tags that we can choose from. We have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's start off with a H1 and let's type in some text in here that says heading 1. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that the text inside of our H1 is going to be a lot larger than any normal text that would write on our page. So if we head below here and write down some normal text, you'll again see that it's much larger. And the reason for that is our browser actually gives some default styles to our H1 element. That one makes our text much larger than normal, and 2, add some spacing around this H1 element. So now let's remove this text that we have here, and let's take a look at the other headings that we can choose from. So the next one we have is heading 2. So in here, let's just type in heading 2. And then what we are going to do is duplicate this down. So Alt, Shift, and down arrow. And that's going to make a copy. And then we're going to do this a couple more times. So H3, H4, H5, and H6. And then we're going to change the text accordingly. So H3, H4, H5, and H6. And we'll also change the tag names. So this third one is going to be H3, this one H4, this one H5, and this one H6. And now you can see that our headings are just getting smaller and smaller as we go through them. And that is because the default styling, the default CSS given to these elements by the browser. And we can actually see these default styles at play if we open our developer tools. So let's hit F12, click on this option here. And if we hover over our headings, you'll see that the default font size is getting smaller and smaller. So at the top here, we have our H1, which starts off at 32 pixels. And then our H2 has a font size of 24 pixels. Our H3 has 18 pixels, H4, 16 pixels, and it continues to get smaller as we progress through our different headings. But these font sizes don't have to be stuck like this forever. We can actually change these using CSS, but that's something we're going to be getting into later on in the program. And with that, that's pretty much it for our headings. So let's close our developer tools and let's head down. And the next thing that we are going to be covering is paragraphs. So let's create a comment. So Control and slash, and we are going to be covering paragraphs. And in order to get a paragraph, we use the P tag. So let's type in P. And a quick tip I'm going to show you is whenever you want to have some sort of dummy text or placeholder text on your page, just type in lorem and then however many words of placeholder text you want. So for example, if you want 20 words of placeholder text, type in lorem 20. If you want 10 words, type in lorem 10, but we're just going to type in 20 for now, and then hit Alt, Shift, and F to let Prettier reformat our code. And you can see that our paragraph is now appearing on our page. And I'm going to quickly zoom out on my browser to 150. And if we hit F12 to open our developer tools, we click on this option here and we hover over our paragraph, we can see that there's also some default styles given to this element by the browser. So it has a default font size of 16 pixels and some spacing on the top and bottom. And if we head back to ASAP Frontend, you'll notice that whenever we have some sort of big block of text on our page, that is when we use the P element. And now that's pretty much it for the paragraph element. But before we move on further, we have to quickly talk about the difference between inline versus block level elements. Now, block elements start on a new line and take up the full available width. But what does this actually mean? Well, if we head back to our code, we can see that all of the elements we currently have on our page are starting on a new line, and if we hover over them, we can also see they are taking up the full available width on the page. And that is because these are all block level elements. And I can actually prove this to you. If we select this H1 and we take a look at the default styles given to it by the browser, you can see that by default it has a display of block, and that means it is a block level element. So we know what block elements are now, but what are inline elements? Well, inline elements do not start on a new line and only take up the necessary width. Now let me show you what I mean by that. So if we head back to our code and I head below this paragraph and I create a B element, and all this does is make text bold. So let's type in something like hello, and you can see that the text is going to be bold by default. And now if I make multiple of these, so Alt, Shift, and down arrow to duplicate this a couple of times, you'll notice that they don't actually start on their own line. So if we take a look at all of the other elements on the page, you can see that they are taking up all of the width on the page, and each element is starting on their own line. But our B elements aren't actually doing that. They are only taking the necessary width to hold their text, and they are side by side. They are not starting on a new line. And this is how we know that they are inline level elements. Now there's a bunch of other inline level elements that you'll find out about as we continue through the crash course, but just quickly, another one is the I element, and all this does is make text italic. So if we type in hello in here, we get our italic text, and it's starting on the same line as the rest of these elements. Now we also have anchor elements. So if we type in A, and in here we type in hello, you can see that gives us a link, and it's starting on the same line as the rest of these elements. And we also have a span. Let's create that. And if we type in hello in here, it starts on the same line as the rest of these elements. So really important stuff here. Make sure you are taking these down as notes. So now let's head back to our code and clean up a little. So let's get rid of all of these extra B elements. And now you're probably pretty confused by this anchor element and this span element. So let's take a moment to talk about these two individually. So let's create a comment. So control and slash. This is going to be span. And then let's create one here. Control slash. This is going to be anchor elements. And now we'll start by talking about anchor elements. So in order to create an anchor element, what do? Well, we just type in A, and the Emmet extension that we installed gives us a nice little abbreviation where we get this anchor element, and we also get this href attribute. And essentially all attributes do is allow us to give a little more information about our elements. So in this case, this href attribute is allowing us to specify where we want to send the user when they click on this link, because that's what anchor elements are. They're just links. So let's say we want to go to google.com when we click on this link, and let's actually add some text between these two tags. And now you can see we get the option to click on this link, but if we do, it's actually not going to work. And the reason for that is we actually haven't added the HTTPS. So one crucial thing for you to remember is when you have your anchor element and you want to send someone to a website, when they click on it, you have to make sure to add the HTTPS to the front of it. And now if we click on our anchor element, it's going to send us to google.com with no issues at all. So again, if you want to go to a website, make sure you are adding the HTTPS. It's going to save you hours of headache. So now let's head back to our web page. And what you'll notice is when we click on this link, it's actually taking us away from our original web page. And a lot of the times, this is not actually what we want to do. So if we head back to ASAP Frontend and we open up this resources tab here and click on the community link, it's actually going to open up the link to the ASAP Frontend community in a new tab. So how do we actually make sure we are doing that in our web page? Well, how we'd normally do this is, and this is just going to be something that you have to remember, is we go to our anchor element, we give it a target attribute, and we give that a value of underscore blank. So target underscore blank. And now when we click on the link, it's going to open up the website in a new tab without closing the original web page. But you might not always want to use this target blank, especially when you're using this link to go to different HTML files, which is actually something you can do. So let's open up our sidebar so I can show you how to actually do that. So what we are going to do is create a new file, and let's call it about.html. So let's pretend this is some sort of different page on our website, you know, maybe an about us page. And now let's use Emmet abbreviation to give us this nice little boilerplate to work on top of. And what I always do is hit Alt Shift and F to make our code a little bit easier on the eyes. And inside of our body, I'm going to create a H1, and in here, let's just say about us page. And now what we can actually do is on this anchor element, we can set the href to about.html, and let's remove this target underscore blank. And now if we click on this link, you can now see that we are actually inside the about.html file. So all of the content that we are seeing right now is coming from the about.html document. And now if we go ahead and add an anchor element inside of our about page and say that we want this to send us to our index.html, and in here, let's say back to index.html. And if we click on this link now, it's going to send us back to our index.html file. So now what we're going to do is close this file. And what we are going to do is jump into a little bit of a challenge to make sure you understood everything you just learned. Because at ASAP Frontend, we don't just want you sitting down and watching me write code. We want you to dive in and get your hands dirty in writing some actual code. So your first challenge is going to be to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com. And one key note is it must open on a new tab. So again, the first challenge is to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com, and it must open on a new tab. And your second challenge is to create a link that opens up a new file called contact.html. So create a new file called contact.html. I want you to render out some content in there, and then inside of our index.html, create a link that is going to send us to that file. So I'll give you a couple of seconds now to pause the video and give this a shot, and we will walk through the solution together once you are done. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you managed to find a solution to this problem. Now let's actually walk through how we would go about solving this problem. So what's our first assignment? It's to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com, and it must open on a new tab. So the first thing we have to do is create an anchor element. And what website are we going to? Well, we're going to asapfrontend.com. So https asapfrontend.com. h2ml.com. Because remember guys, if we're going to some sort of external link, some sort of external website, we need to have the HTTPS or it's not going to work. And now let's quickly type in some text inside of this anchor element. And now if we click on this link, we should be going to asapfrontend.com. And it looks like we are, but it's not opening up in a new tab like it's supposed to. It's taking us away from our original web page. So in order to make sure that that is not happening and we are opening up a new tab when we click on this link, we have to create a target attribute and we are going to give it a value of _blank. And now if we click on this link, it's going to open up a new tab and send us to asapfrontend.com. So that is our first assignment complete. So now let's move on to our second assignment, which is to create a link that opens up a new file called contact.html. So the first step in this process is to actually create our contact.html file. So let's open up our sidebar and create a new file called contact.html. And here, let's use our Emmet boilerplate and then Alt, Shift, and F. And in here, let's create a H1. And this is going to say contact page, just so we know that we're actually in the contact page. And now we can close out this sidebar and head back to our index.html. Let's create a new anchor element. And we want this link that we just created to open up our contact.html file. So what's the href of this link going to be? It's going to be contact.html. And this time we don't have to add on the target blank since we aren't opening this up in a new tab, and we can just type in contact page in here. And if we head back to our page and click on this link, it'll take us to our contact.html file. And we know it's our contact.html file because we can see our H1 here. So that's it for our challenges. What we are going to do now is clean up our code just a little bit. Let's add a little bit of space here. And what we are going to do is get rid of this span. And we're going to create a comment. And in here, we are going to write lists because that is the next HTML topic that we are going to cover. So let's head back to index.html so that we can dive straight into lists. Now in HTML, there is actually two kinds of lists. There's ordered lists and unordered lists. And we are going to start by covering ordered lists because that is the one that you are going to be using most often. We'll still cover ordered lists, but we'll do that after. So in order to create an unordered list, you just type in UL, so UL, and typically inside of a list, you have different list items, right? You have different bullet points. So in order to create those different dot points, those different list items, we use the LI element, which stands for list item. And again, these are going to be the different list items, the different dot points within our list. So now we've created 3 list items, and in here, we can say text1. In the second one, we can say text2. And in the third one, we can say text3. And now what we can do is use Prettier, so Alt, Shift, and F to reformat our code and make it look a lot more readable. And now if we head back to our page, you can actually see we are getting a list with different dot points. And we can also see that a list item is actually a block level element. So if we click on this option here and hover over our unordered list, you can see that it's starting on a new line and taking up the full available width on the page. Now, these list items don't always have to have bullet points. Using CSS, we can actually customize this and make them have different kinds of points and actually make them have no points at all. It all really depends on what you want, but again, we're going to be covering CSS later on in the program. Now, typically we use unordered lists when the order of our lists doesn't really matter. And let me visualize this to you by creating a quick grocery list with you. So let's head above this unordered list and let's create a H1 that says grocery list. So let's say we are at the grocery store and we want to get some apples, some bananas, and some grapes. Now, the order that we put these fruits in doesn't really matter. We could start by getting the bananas and then move on to the grapes and then finish off with the apples, or we could start off getting the grapes and then move on to bananas and then get the apples. Again, it doesn't really matter, and that is where we would be using an unordered list. And this is going to be the case 99% of the time. But if the order of your list really does matter and you want to have that structure, that is when you would be using an ordered list. So to create an ordered list, we use the OL tag instead of the UL tag. And the structure of ordered list and unordered list are exactly the same. We have different list items in here for all of the different list items, the different bullet points. But now let's say this list is a little bit different. It's not a grocery list. It's now a leaderboard. And let's say in first place, we have Usain Bolt. In second place, we have Ronaldo. And third place, we have Messi. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that our ordered list actually gives us some numbers to order our list by. So this is just something that is good to remember. If the order of your list doesn't matter, then you want to use an unordered list. And that is going to be the case 99% of the time. But if the order of your list does matter, then use an ordered list and you will get numbers to order your list by. And now that's pretty much everything you need to know about lists. Now the next thing we are going to cover is forms. And how we are going to create a form element is we just type in form and we can use the Emmet abbreviation to get our form element. And you can see that we actually get an action attribute by default. And how this action attribute works is when the user fills in all the details of this form and submits it, it's inside of this action attribute that we specify what we actually want to do once the user has submitted the form. And let me give you a quick example. If we open up ASAP Frontend and we hit on login, you'll see that all of this information that you can fill in is surrounded by a form. So we put all of the information that we want the user to fill in inside of a form. And once the user fills in all of the information, would go ahead and log the user in using a programming language like JavaScript. So would say that the action that we want to perform after the user submits this form is logging the user in using JavaScript. But since we don't know any programming languages right now, we can go ahead and remove this action attribute for now. And now we can head back to our HTML document and let's actually talk about the kind of elements we would be putting inside of a HTML form. Now, the first element would put inside of a form is a label element, and we can remove this for attribute. It's not really too important. And inside of this element, let's type in first name, and below it, let's create an input element. Now, immediately you are going to notice two really weird things about our input element. First, why doesn't it have an end tag? And second, why does it have a type? Well, this is actually our first example of a self-closing tag. So this input element doesn't actually need a closing tag. And now a quick best practice that I want to show you is whenever you have a self-closing tag like this, you want to go to the end and add a /. And this helps us keep our code more consistent and clear. And this just gives us a way to know that this is not a start tag that we forgot to close. It makes it very clear that, okay, this is a self-closing tag. Now, why this input has a type attribute is because there is actually multiple different kinds of inputs that we can use. So with that being said, let's go ahead and select all of this and Alt, Shift, and down arrow to duplicate it down so we can talk about the different input types, starting with the email input. So let's change the label to say email. And in order to turn this text input into an email input, all we need to do is change this type from text to email. And now if we head back to our page and I zoom out, we can see that we have our text input and our email input side by side. And that is because all of these elements are inline level elements, meaning they are not going to start on a new line. But let's say we wanted to have our first name label and first name input on one line, and then have our email label and email input on another line, just like we have here on ASAP frontend. How do we actually tell HTML that that is how we want to lay out our page? Well, in order to do that, we have to use the div element. And what I'm going to do is put our first name label and input inside of one div, and then put our email label and input in another. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that we have our first name label and input on one line together, and then we have our email label and input on another line together. And that is really the whole purpose of divs. If we hover over it, you can see that VS Code tells us that a div element has no special meaning at all. It's not like it's specifically a title, a paragraph, or anything like that. What div actually stands for is division. So we use div elements to sort of separate and divide the pieces of content on our page into different little sections. So in this example, you can see that we put all of the stuff to do with our first name, so our label and our input, inside of one div. And then we put all of the stuff to do with our email in another div. And this sort of just helps to keep everything separated and easy to understand. So we can look at this and say, okay, all of the stuff to do with the first name we put inside of here, and all of the stuff to do with the email we put inside of here. And that just makes our code easier to read, rather than having all of our inputs and labels jumbled together in one form. And a nice little side effect that we get when we use divs is that they are actually a block level element by default. And this makes div elements come in very handy for when we want to sort of section out and work with inline elements on our page. But with that being said, let's head back to covering our inputs. Now, the reason we use an input with a type of email rather than a type of text, because an email is literally just text, right? So why don't we just use the input with a type of text? Is because the email input gives us some extra validation to make sure what we are typing in here is actually an email. And let me show you what I mean by this by heading to the ASAP frontend website. If I fill out this password and I enter an invalid email into this email input, we're going to get a rect squiggly line, and you can see we're also getting an error saying please include an @ in the email address. What we have written in is missing an @. So it's saying, look, your email address is not valid. Give us a valid email address. So again, all the type of email does is give us a little bit of extra validation that makes our life easier in the long run. So now let's head back to our HTML document and look at a few more input types. So let's duplicate this down. So let's select this, Alt Shift and down arrow. And the next type of input we are going to be looking at is the password input. So let's change the type to password and the label to password. And now if we head back to our page and we type something inside of this input, you can see that it's actually going to be hidden, just like a regular password. So now let's duplicate this down again. So Alt Shift and down arrow to take a look at our next kind of input. And that is going to be the number input. So let's change the label to number and the type to number. Now, using the number input is pretty self-explanatory. We have the option to increase the number inside of this input as well as decrease it. And we can also come in here and type in a custom number. But of course, we can't type in any text values. It will not let you. Now let's duplicate this down one more time to look at our last input. And that is going to be the date input. And this one is also pretty self-explanatory. We get this nice UI that allows us to select and choose from a range of dates. And of course, we can also come in here and custom change these values. Now what we're going to be doing next is going through a couple of elements that behave a lot like inputs, but don't actually use the input tag. And I know that sounds pretty confusing, but once I explain it to you, it's all going to make sense. So what we're going to do is duplicate this div down. And now let's say we wanted to create a message input. So one of those big message inputs where people can write you, say, an email. Now, in order to do that, we are not going to be using the input element. What we actually have to do is use the text area element, and we can get rid of all of this weird stuff here. And the first difference you'll notice between the text area and the input is this is actually not a self-closing tag, and we also don't have to add the type attribute. And what you'll notice is if we head back to our page, while these inputs are way too small to write any sort of message in, we can actually change the size of our text area however we please so that we are able to write long-winded email messages inside of this text area. So now let's refresh our page to get our text area back to normal. And now the last input that we are going to be covering is a select element. So let's change this label to select. And in order to get our select element, we're going to remove this text area and then create our select element. And where we typically use a select element on our page is when the user can choose between a couple of different options. So for example, let's say we were having the user choose the size of their clothing on our website. So if the user is choosing the size of their clothes, they have to have options to choose from, right? So what we'd do is for each option that the user can choose, we add an option element inside of our select element. So let me give you some examples. So let's create an option element, and let's say that the first option the user can choose is extra small. So we type in XS, and then let's Alt Shift down arrow to duplicate this down a couple of times and create a couple more options. The second option is going to be S, so small. The third option is going to be medium. The fourth option is going to be large. And now if we head back to our page, we can actually choose between these 4 options. Now, one thing you always want to remember is you want to fill in the value attributes of these options. So our first one gets a value of extra small. Our second one gets a value of small. Third one, medium. And our last one, large. And the reason we do this is when the user submits the form and we want to work with the option that the user chose inside of a programming language like JavaScript, this just makes our life doing that a lot easier. So now what I want to talk about next is how we can actually submit a form. So if we head to ASAP Frontend, you'll notice that at the bottom of our form, we have this button, and when we hit this button, our form is submitted and we go ahead and log the user in. So in order to submit our form, all we need to do is add a button to the bottom of our form, and we can have some text that says submit inside of this button. And now if we head back to our page and click this submit button, nothing is actually going to happen. And that is because we don't actually have a programming language like JavaScript to perform some sort of action when the form is submitted. And with that, that's pretty much everything you need to know about HTML forms. But before we move on to our next topic, there is just one last thing that I want to show you. So if we head back to the login form at ASAP Frontend, what you'll notice is that our inputs actually have this sort of gray placeholder text, and whenever we type in some text, it actually disappears. And this honestly looks really good. But the question is, how do we actually get this on our inputs? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Let's scroll up to our first input. So let's say our text input, and all we have to do to get that placeholder text is use the placeholder attribute, and we can type in whatever we want in here, but in this case, let's just say type in your first name. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that we are getting that cool placeholder text. But if we type something in here, it disappears. But again, when the input is empty, the placeholder comes back. So that's just something cool that I wanted to show you. But with that, we are officially finished with forms. So let's head below our form and create a new comment. So control and /. And in here, we are going to type in images because that is the next topic that we are going to cover. In order to use images in HTML, we use the img tag. And what you'll notice is just like an input element, this is a self-closing tag. And what did we do for the input element, which was a self-closing tag? We added a / to the end of it just to keep our code consistent and easier to read. Now, by default, we get two attributes with our image elements. The first one being the src attribute. And this is actually how we tell HTML where to look for our image. And there's actually two ways we can do this. First, we can tell HTML to look externally, so on the internet for our image, or we can tell HTML to search locally within our computer, within our machine for that image. And we are going to start by covering that first method. So let's head back to ASAP frontend, and we're going to right click on this logo and hit copy image address. And then what we'll do is paste that into this src attribute. And now if we head back to our page, you can see we're getting the ASAP frontend logo as our image. Now let's say we wanted another image from the internet. Let's say we wanted an image of Superman. Well, what we could do is go to Google, search for Superman, click on images, and we can right click and copy image address on any of these images and just paste it directly into this src attribute. And now if we head back to our page, we have Superman appearing as our image. And that is how we get an image from the internet externally. But the question is, how do we get an image that is stored locally on our device? Well, let me teach you how to do this by first installing this image. So let's save image as, and then let's go to our desktop and then go within the HTML crash course folder. And here, let's save this image under the file name Superman. And now if we open up our sidebar, we should be seeing superman.jpg inside of our HTML crash course folder. Now what we need to do in order to get this image displaying on our page is we have to remove all of this stuff here. And we can simply just say that we want to use the Superman .jpg image. And now if we take a look at our live server, you can see that we have the same Superman image appearing on our page. And the reason we can just write superman.jpg inside of the src attribute and it works is because our Superman image and our index.html file are in the exact same folder on the exact same level. So they're literally in the exact same folder and they are side by side. And because of that, we don't have to do anything extra. We can just type in superman.jpg and it works. But let's say we had this image inside of an images or assets folder. So let's drag and drop this in. Well, what you'll notice is since our image and our index.html file are no longer on the same level, this is not actually going to work anymore. And the reason for that is that HTML by default starts by searching for files on the same level as the current HTML file. So this is what HTML sees right now, and it's searching for a superman.jpg image that's on the same level as this HTML file. So it's looking for this superman.jpg file, but it's not going to find it. It's only going to see this assets folder. It's not going to see any deeper. So what we need to do is specify that we want to go inside of the assets folder, and inside of that, we want to grab superman.jpg. So in the image src, we have to specify that we're first going inside of the assets folder, and then inside of the assets folder, we want to grab the superman.jpg image. And now if we head back to our page, we can now see our image is appearing properly. But let's say we had another folder inside of this assets folder called images. And let's say only in there did we have our Superman image. And on a side note, you can see that VS Code is doing this weird thing that is making it difficult to tell what is going on. So in order to fix that, what we are quickly going to do is click on this top option here, head to File, Preferences and Settings. And in here, we are going to search for compact folders. and make sure that is unchecked. And that is going to set this back to normal and make this easier to understand. So now back to the question at hand. How do we tell HTML that we want to go inside of our assets folder, and then inside of our images folder, and then inside of that, we want to grab our Superman image? Well, I'm actually going to give you a couple of seconds to figure that out for yourself. Try and figure out how to tell HTML that we want to go inside of our assets folder and our images folder and grab our superman.jpg image. I'll give you a couple of seconds to give that a shot, and once you are done, we can walk through the solution together. Hey, welcome back. Hopefully you managed to find a solution to this problem. So now let's actually take a moment to think about how we can solve this problem. So let's start off by closing our images and our assets folder and searching for our image like HTML would. Well, how would HTML look for our image? Well, it would start by looking through files and folders that are on the same level as index.html. So it's looking through, it's trying to find the assets folder, and bang, it's found its match. So we've found the assets folder. What are we going to do next? Well, we are going to go inside and look for superman.jpg. So we go within the assets folder and look for superman.jpg, but this is what HTML sees. All it sees is this images folder. It doesn't see superman.jpg. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to specify that we want to go inside of the assets folder, inside of the images folder, and only then can we look for superman.jpg. So we have to say we want to go within the assets folder, and then go within the images folder, and then grab superman.jpg. And now you can see our image is appearing on our page. So I hope the solution made sense. And those are the two ways we can search for images using the src attribute. We can search for the image locally within our computer, or we can search for the image externally on the internet by copying the image address and just pasting it straight into the src attribute. Now there's one last thing that we have to cover about images, and that is this alt attribute right here. It's not super important, but it's just here for accessibility purposes. So let's say someone is blind and they are using what we call a screen reader. So that's just something that sort of goes through your website and describes the content to the blind person. This alt attribute is where we tell the screen reader what our image is actually about, so that it can correctly describe it to the blind person. So in the alt attribute, we'll just say something like, this is a Superman image, and this is what the screen reader would read out to the blind person. And now that's pretty much it for images. Now we're going to be moving on to our next topic. So let's create a comment using control and /. And the next topic that we are going to cover is going to be buttons. So buttons are pretty simple. All we have to do to create a button is use the button tag. And between these two tags, we can of course write in whatever we want to see inside of our button. So in this example, I wrote click me, and now you can see we have a button that says click me. And what we can actually see here is that images and buttons are actually inline level elements. So they are actually going to be side by side, and they aren't going to start on a new line. And I actually don't like that. I'd like this button to be on its own line. So what I'm going to do is create a div, and then I'm going to place this button inside of this div. And since a div is a block level element, it's going to start this button on a new line. And this is another example of where divs come in really handy in helping us sort of organize and lay out the content on our page. And with that, that is pretty much it for buttons. Now the last thing we are going to be covering is spans. So let's create a new comment, control and /. And in here, let's type in spans. Now, the reason we'd use a span element is, let's say we had a paragraph, and let's say this paragraph said land a job with ASAP front end. And like I mentioned earlier on in the video, we can actually bold certain text by using the B tag. So if we put ASAP front end inside of the B element, if we scroll down, we can actually see land a job with ASAP Frontend in bold. But let's say instead of setting ASAP Frontend to bold, let's say we wanted to change the color. Well, what we would do is instead of wrapping ASAP Frontend in the B tags, we would wrap them in a span. And what we would do is we would give this what we call a class name, and using CSS, we would go in and target this individual span. And again, in CSS, we would give it, say, a color of red. And don't worry, I know you don't know how to do any of this stuff yet, but I just wanted to quickly show you this to give you an idea of why we would actually use spans. And with that, I want to say a huge congratulations to you, because we have actually completed the HTML crash course. And what we've actually done throughout this entire video is created a HTML cheat sheet that you can refer back to whenever you get stuck. So let's say you're trying to create some headings. What you can do is come back to this cheat sheet and look at all of the different headings that you can use. Or maybe you get stuck when you are creating a form. You can come down here and see all of the different types of inputs that you can use. Or maybe you're struggling with images. Well, you can come down here and see all of the different ways that we can set our images. And I've got some good news for you. This is pretty much all of the HTML that you need to know in order to land a 6-figure front-end developer job. Now, if you are still feeling confused and feel like you don't understand anything, don't worry, you are not meant to. This crash course is just meant to give you a basic idea of how everything works. So even if you kinda understand what's going on, you are doing really well. And if we head to ASAP Frontend, you can see just how many projects we are going to do to drill these fundamentals into you. So again, don't worry if you aren't understanding things right now. That is going to come with time.